The wind carried winter across Wyoming territory, rattling the windows of the small ranch house, where two men sat in the amber glow of lamplight. Caleb Stone, 80 years carved into weathered oak, watched his grandson pack for a journey that might end in blood. On the table between them lay a surveyor's compass, a Winchester rifle still gleaming with factory oil, and a leather book so old its spine had cracked into a dozen pieces. Thomas Stone, 19, and restless, folded his last shirt into the traveling bag. His hands moved with the careful precision of youth, trying to appear confident. The railroad company had hired him to survey new routes through disputed territory land, where homesteaders and corporate interests collided like storm fronts. Good pay, they had said, important work, but the stories coming back told of hired guns and families driven from their claims at gunpoint. "Grandpa," Thomas said, not looking up from his packing, "what do I do if the law sides with the railroad, if judges rule against the homesteaders, and I'm there mapping the routes for their removal?" Caleb's fingers, gnarled but still strong, reached across the table. He touched the ruined ledger with something close to reverence. The leather cover was stained dark in places, though whether from water or blood, Thomas could not tell. "Before I answer that, boy, I need to tell you about a night 50 years ago. A night when I opened my door to a stranger in a blizzard, and that single choice cost me everything I owned and gave me everything I needed to become a man worth being." Thomas stopped packing. In all his years, he had never heard his grandfather speak of what happened before the Wyoming ranch, before the quiet life of cattle and solitude. The old man's past remained locked behind silence as thick as prison walls. Caleb opened the ledger to its first page. The handwriting there was elegant, but rushed the ink faded to brown. Thomas leaned closer to read the words that had waited half a century to be shared. "If you're reading this, I'm dead, but the truth doesn't die with me." Marshall Joseph Whitmore, April 1843. The lamp flickered. Outside, the November wind howled like something hunting. "That book nearly killed me," Caleb said. "Nearly killed everyone who touched it, but it also saved more lives than I can count, and it taught me the answer to your question. Sometimes the law is wrong, and when it is, a good man has to choose between what's legal and what's right. That choice defines everything that follows." Thomas pulled a chair closer, his journey suddenly less urgent than the story waiting to unfold. "I was 30 years old," Caleb began, his voice settling into the rhythm of memory, "living alone in the Rocky Mountains 15 miles from the nearest soul. I had run from civilization after Texas, after Goliad, after I learned what good men are capable of when orders replace conscience. 7 years I spent in those mountains trapping beaver, hunting elk, and trying to forget the sound of muskets firing into unarmed men." The old man's eyes grew distant, seeing snow that had melted half a century ago. "The night it all changed started like any other November evening. Cold coming down from the peaks like an avalanche in slow motion. I knew the signs. Jays gone quiet, wind shifting northeast, cloud banks building purple and black over the continental divide. A mountain storm, the kind that buries trails and kills the unprepared. The mountain before the storm. The cabin Caleb had built sat at 9,200 feet, perched on a granite shelf that overlooked a valley of spruce and aspen. He had chosen the location with the tactical mind of a man who had survived war. 3 sides protected by cliff faces, one approach narrow and exposed. Gun ports hidden in the log walls. A lean-to for his horse positioned where he could reach it without exposing himself to rifle fire. That morning he had run his trap line before dawn. 15 sets scattered across 3 miles of creek and timber. He moved through the forest like smoke reading tracks the way educated men read books. Here, a pine marten had investigated his bait but refused the trigger. There, a beaver had dragged an aspen branch across the trail, its teeth marks fresh and clean. He collected 3 beaver pelts and 2 marten, skinning them with the efficiency of 7 years' practice. His Hawken rifle, 50 caliber, and custom built in St. Louis in 1838, never left his hands during the circuit. The weapon had cost him 2 years' worth of pelts, but it could drop an elk at 200 yards or punch through a man's chest at 50. He kept it loaded, always the powder fresh, the flint napped sharp. Back at the cabin, he worked the pelts on his stretching frames, scraping membrane and fat with methodical strokes. His hands moved without conscious thought, leaving his mind free to wander the paths it always wandered. Back to Texas, back to March of 1836. Back to the day 342 men knelt in a line, while officers read out their death sentence. He had refused the order, refused to execute prisoners who had surrendered under promise of clemency. They had beaten him for it, stripped his rank, called him coward. But he had not pulled the trigger. 12 other men had made the same choice. The rest obeyed. The muskets fired. The prisoners fell. Caleb drove the fleshing knife harder against the pelt, trying to scrape away the memory along with the fat. By midday, he had the pelts stretched and the frames hung inside to dry. His stores were good. 500 pounds of dried venison and elk, 2 barrels of cornmeal traded from a passing merchant, enough whiskey to kill the dreams on the worst nights, enough ammunition to fight off a small army or feed himself for another year. He checked his weapons with the ritual that kept him sane. The Hawken first running a patch through the barrel, checking the lock mechanism, ensuring the percussion caps were dry. Then the spare Kentucky long rifle, older but reliable. Finally, his 2 Patterson Colt revolvers, rare pieces acquired from a Texas Ranger who had died of cholera on the Santa Fe Trail. 5 shots each. In an 1843, that kind of firepower made a man dangerous as a mountain cat. His Bowie knife, 14 inches of Sheffield steel, held an edge that could shave the hair from his arm. He stropped it against leather until the blade sang. The sky darkened early. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour. Caleb brought his horse, a steel gray stallion with the temperament of a widowmaker, into the lean-to attached to the cabin's north wall. He filled the water barrels from the creek before it froze, stacked firewood inside until the cabin's corner held a week's worth of split pine and aspen, packed snow around the foundation for insulation. Everything he did with the precision of a man who understood that in the mountains, small mistakes became fatal within hours. As twilight bled into full dark, he built up the fire and set coffee to boil. The cabin's single room felt smaller when the storms came, but it was tight and warm. His bedroll lay in the corner farthest from the door. His rifles hung on pegs within arm's reach. The gun ports, invisible from outside, gave him firing angles that covered the entire approach. He poured coffee into a tin cup and sat at the rough table he had built from pine planks. The wind outside began to howl, rattling the shutters. Snow hissed against the walls. The storm had arrived. Caleb stared into his coffee, watching steam rise and dissipate. 7 years of this. 7 years of silence, broken only by wind and his own breathing. 7 years of running from the sound of muskets in the faces of men who had trusted false promises. He was reaching for the whiskey bottle when he saw it. Through the crack in the shutter, visible in the last gray light of dusk, a dark line traced across new snow. Too straight to be animal, too purposeful to be wind drift. A blood trail, fresh, leading towards his cabin. Caleb set down the coffee cup. His hand found the Hawken rifle without thought, muscle memory from a life lived on the edge of violence. He moved to the gun port, peering through the narrow slit. The blood trail led from the tree line, crossing 60 yards of open ground. Whoever had made it was still moving an hour ago, still bleeding, still coming. He checked his ammunition. Loaded, primed, ready. The knock came just after full dark. 3 strikes against the door. Not strong, not demanding. Just desperate enough to cut through the storm's noise. Caleb did not ask who was there. Words were wasted on the desperate and dangerous alike. He positioned himself beside the door, rifle ready, and lifted the heavy bar. The door swung inward, and the storm tried to follow, wind shrieking and snow swirling into the warm cabin. In the doorway stood a woman. She wore the black habit of a Catholic nun, the fabric soaked through and clinging to her frame. A silver crucifix hung at her throat, catching firelight. Her face, pale and sharp-featured, showed no tears despite the blood spreading across her left shoulder. Her eyes met his without pleading, without fear, with only the hard calculation of someone who had learned to measure odds and accept them. "Sanctuary," she said. One word. Her voice carried the accent of education, Eastern schools, and proper grammar, not the rough frontier drawl of miners and homesteaders. Caleb studied her for 3 seconds. That felt like minutes. The blood was real. The wound in her shoulder had soaked through the heavy wool. But her boots were not nun's boots. They were buckskin and fur, broken in and practical. Her hands clasped together as if in prayer showed calluses on the fingers and ink stains on the thumb and forefinger. "Who shot you?" His voice came out rusty. He had not spoken to another person in 6 weeks. "Men I'm running from." They follow you here. She glanced at the snow already covering her tracks. The storm will hide the trail until morning. Caleb made his calculation. She was lying about something, maybe everything, but she was also bleeding, and the storm outside would kill her in an hour. He stepped aside. Come in. She entered without thanks, her eyes scanning the cabin's interior with the trained assessment of someone who understood tactical spaces. She noted the gun ports, the rifle rack, the back window that could serve as an escape route. Her gaze lingered on each for just a moment before moving on. You built this to defend, she said, not a question. Caleb closed the door against the storm and dropped the bar back into place. He gestured toward the fire without speaking. She moved to the hearth, and only then did her composure crack slightly. She swayed, catching herself against the stone chimney. The wound was taking its toll. Sit, Caleb said, pulling the chair closer to the fire. She obeyed, lowering herself with care. Her hands went to the shoulder wound, probing through the fabric with practiced efficiency. She knew anatomy, knew what she was looking for. Caleb watched from across the room, rifle still in hand. You know medicine. Enough to know this needs to come out. She reached into the folds of her habit and produced a small knife, the blade clean and sharp. I can do it, Caleb offered. I've done it before. She pulled the habit down, revealing a simple cotton shift beneath, and exposed the wound. The bullet had entered from behind, punching through the trapezius muscle and lodging against the collarbone. Not fatal if treated, fatal if left. She sterilized the blade in the fire, then bit down on a strip of leather from her belt. Caleb turned away, giving her privacy, but he heard the wet sound of the blade entering flesh, the muffled grunt of pain, the clink of lead hitting the floor. When he looked back, she had the bullet out and was packing the wound with cloth torn from her shift. Her face had gone gray, sweat beading on her forehead, but her hands remained steady. Caleb poured whiskey into a cup and handed it to her. She drank without hesitation, the alcohol bringing color back to her cheeks. Thank you, she said, the first softness in her voice. He nodded and poured coffee, setting the cup within her reach. Then he stepped back to his position by the door rifle across his knees. They sat in silence while the storm hammered the cabin. The fire crackled. Snow hissed against the shutters. The woman drank her coffee with both hands wrapped around the cup, absorbing its warmth. Caleb studied her. When she had removed the habit's outer layer, he had seen something else. Another bloodstain on her ribs, older and already healing. Multiple injuries, multiple attacks. This woman had been running for more than a day or two. She caught him looking and met his gaze without shame. My name is Sarah Whitmore. My father was Federal Marshal Joseph Whitmore. He died 4 months ago because of this. She reached into the inner lining of her habit, where the fabric had been specially sewn to create a hidden pocket. From it, she withdrew a book wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a ledger bound in worn leather. Caleb did not reach for it. And what is this? Evidence, names, dates, numbers. 3 years of investigation into corruption stretching from Santa Fe to Denver. Land fraud, murder for hire, judges bought, sheriffs paid, homesteaders killed for their claims. She opened the ledger, showing him pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Entries cross-referenced with dates and witness signatures. Land deed numbers, payment amounts, a catalog of crimes written with the precision of a legal scholar. She turned to page 8 and pointed to an entry. Payment to Enforcer S. Crow, $500 for removal of homesteader family grant, October 1842. Witnessed by Territorial Land Agent Marcus Webb. Caleb's hand tightened on the rifle. I knew the Grant family. 5 people died in a fire. Cabin burned to the ground. Not a fire, Sarah said. Murder, and not the only one. There are 64 similar entries in this ledger. 64 men who profit from stealing land and killing anyone who resists. My father spent 3 years documenting it all. They killed him to stop it from reaching a judge who might actually prosecute. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind's pitch rose to a keening wail. Caleb stared at the ledger, at the careful handwriting that represented dead families and stolen futures. Why did you come here? Santa Fe is 300 miles south. Denver's even farther. Sarah's eyes, dark and unwavering, locked onto his. Because I know about you, Caleb Stone, former soldier in the Texas Revolution, the man who held the North Wall during the Alamo Retreat. The man who refused orders to execute Mexican prisoners at Goliad. The man who's been hiding in these mountains for 7 years because he couldn't live with what he saw good men do. The cabin seemed to shrink. The warmth from the fire could not touch the sudden cold that gripped Caleb's chest. His past, the thing he had run from, had found him in the voice of a wounded woman carrying a book of the damned. "You investigated me. My father investigated you. He said if anything happened to him, I should find Caleb Stone. He said you were the last man with a conscience strong enough to stand against an entire corrupt system. The last man who chose honor over orders." Caleb stood him, rifle trembling in his hands. Rage and shame warred inside him, each feeding the other. "You used me, led your hunters to my door." "I chose you," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference." A sound from outside cut through their confrontation. Not the wind, not the storm. A horse neighing once before the sound was cut short. Caleb moved to the gun port in a single fluid motion. Through the narrow slit, he could see nothing but swirling snow and darkness. But someone was out there, close enough to quiet a horse, close enough to attack. He turned to Sarah, his decision made in the space of a heartbeat. Whatever her manipulations, whatever lies wrapped her truth, the men with guns were coming. And Caleb Stone had spent 7 years preparing for exactly this moment. "Get behind the table. Know how to shoot." She nodded. He handed her the Kentucky rifle. "Loaded. Don't waste shots." Sarah took the weapon, checking the mechanism without being told, positioning herself with a clear firing lane to the door. Her hands were steady now, fear transformed into focus. Caleb took his position at the east gun port, hawk and ready. His breathing slowed. His hands stopped shaking. 7 years of isolation fell away, and he became what he had been before Goliad broke him. A soldier, a survivor, a man who knew how to kill when killing was required. The voice that came through the storm was loud enough to carry over the wind, confident enough to expect an answer. "Caleb Stone, we know the woman's inside. Hand her over and we'll leave you breathing." Caleb said nothing, let his silence be the answer. "We're not here for you, Stone, just the woman in the book. Walk away from this, and you live to see morning." Sarah's whisper cut across the cabin. "Silas Crow's men. He's the enforcer. He killed my father." Caleb's jaw clenched. Through the gun port, he could see movement. 4 shapes spreading out, taking positions around the cabin. But the spacing was wrong, too much gap on the west side. He moved to the west gun port. There. A 5th man flanking, trying to reach the cabin wall without being seen. The tactical situation crystallized in his mind. 4 rifles visible. 1 shotgun based on the barrel length. 1 flanker. 6 men total, maybe more hanging back. They had numbers. He had walls and angles. The first shot came without further warning. A rifle cracked the bullet, punching through the shutter and embedding in the far wall. Then another. Then a volley as all 4 visible attackers opened fire. Wood splintered, glass shattered, the cabin filled with the thunder of incoming lead and the acrid smell of gunpowder drifting through the broken shutter. Caleb counted the muzzle flashes. 4 rifles. Reload time approximately 20 seconds. He waited, letting them empty their weapons. The moment the firing stopped, he moved. The Hawken roared, its heavy lead ball smashing through the gun port and into the chest of the first attacker. The man went down without a sound, dead before he hit the snow. Caleb reloaded with a muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions. 15 seconds. Powder. Patch. Ball. Ram. Prime. Ready. He shifted to the south gun port. Another muzzle flash gave him a target. He fired. The shot took the second attacker in the shoulder, spinning him around. The man screamed, his rifle falling from his hands. Sarah's rifle cracked from across the cabin. She missed, but the shot forced one attacker to dive for cover, disrupting their coordinated assault. "Aim for the shadow, not the man," Caleb said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Helps if you've never killed before." She nodded, reloading faster than he expected. Her father had taught her well. The flanker reached the cabin wall. Caleb heard boots against wood, heard the man trying the door. He had anticipated this. The coffee pot, still hot from the fire, sat within reach. He grabbed it and poured boiling liquid through the crack beneath the door. The scream that followed was pure agony. The flanker fell back, clutching his scalded legs. Caleb kicked the door open, both Patterson Colts in his hands. The revolvers were rare in 1843, their rotating cylinders a marvel of engineering that most men had never seen. The flanker looked up just in time to see both barrels aimed at his chest. Caleb fired twice. The man jerked and went still. Another attacker rushed the open door. Caleb's third shot took him in the throat. The fourth shot missed the fifth, caught the man in the hip. He went down screaming. The final two attackers broke and ran their boots pounding through the snow toward the tree line. One was wounded, limping badly. The other was the one Sarah had forced into cover. Caleb did not pursue. He stood in the doorway, revolvers smoking, and watched them disappear into the storm. Silence fell, just the wind and the crackle of the fire and the harsh breathing of two people who had just survived their first battle together. Two bodies lay in the snow outside. Blood pooled and froze. The wounded man Caleb had shot in the hip crawled toward the trees, leaving a trail of red behind him. Caleb holstered the Colts and picked up his rifle. He reloaded it carefully, his hands steady. Sarah stood beside the overturned table, her rifle still aimed at the door, her whole body shaking now that the danger had passed. He saw her staring at the bodies, saw the crucifix clutched tight in her free hand, saw the moment when the reality of what she had participated in crashed over her like an avalanche. "I'm a Christian," she whispered. "Thou shalt not kill." Caleb poured whiskey into 2 cups. He pressed one into her hand and drank the other himself. "Thou shalt not murder. There's a difference. You defended yourself. That's not murder." She drank the alcohol, burning away some of the shock. "I studied to be a nun. Before my father needed me as his legal assistant. Before all of this, I took the commandments seriously." "So did I," Caleb said. "Still do, but there's killing and there's murder. Tonight was killing, and if we hadn't, we'd be the ones dead in the snow." He moved to the door, stepping over the body of the flanker. The other corpse lay 10 feet away, face down, snow already beginning to cover him. Caleb knelt and searched the bodies. From the first, he pulled a crumpled note from an inside pocket. The handwriting was crude but legible. Sister Margaret or Sarah Whitmore, $5,000. The ledger, $10,000, stone kill on sight. He brought the note inside and showed it to Sarah. Her face paled. "They know both your identities," Caleb said. "The nun and the woman, and they know I'll protect you." "How could they know that?" Caleb returned to the second body. This search yielded another note, this one more carefully written, the paper of better quality. "Sea Stone confirmed at coordinates. Crow sends word, remember Goliad. You owe me." The words hit like a physical blow. Caleb stood slowly, the note shaking in his hand. "Silas Crow," he said, the name tasting of ash and blood. I knew him. Texas, 1836. He was an officer who volunteered to execute prisoners at Goliad. Young, only 18, but he smiled while he did it. Smiled while he shot unarmed men who had surrendered under promise of mercy. I refused the order. He never forgot. Sarah stood. Despite her wound, despite the shock, her voice remained steady. "Then this isn't just about the ledger anymore. This is personal for him." "It always was," Caleb said. "For him, I'm the coward who chose conscience over duty, the man who made him look bad by refusing. He's been waiting 7 years for a chance to prove I was wrong." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm had begun. The past and present colliding, the ledger and the gun. The woman who had manipulated him into this fight, and the man who had been running from fights for 7 years. Caleb dragged the bodies away from the cabin, out into the storm where animals and weather would deal with them by spring. It was brutal work but necessary. He would not sleep with corpses outside his door. When he returned, snow-covered and exhausted, Sarah had coffee waiting. She had also found his medical supplies and was rebandaging her shoulder with fresh cloth. "You used me," Caleb said again, but the anger had burned out of his voice. Now it was just statement of fact. "Yes," Sarah admitted. "I researched you. My father researched you. In 1837, he investigated the Goliad massacre. He found 3 survivors who told him about the man who refused to execute prisoners. The man who was beaten, degraded, but never broke. That man was you." Caleb sank into the chair across from her. "I didn't save them. I just didn't kill them. That's not heroism." "Exactly," Sarah said. "That's why my father trusted you. Heroes die in grand gestures. Survivors with consciences change the world slowly." He said if anything happened to him, I should find Caleb Stone, the man who understood that sometimes refusing to act is the bravest action of all. I'm not that man anymore. I've been hiding for 7 years. But you let me in tonight. You could have turned me away. You could have shut the door and let the storm take me. But you didn't. That man is still in there, whether you want him to be or not. Caleb looked at the ledger lying on the table between them. 7 years of peace, 7 years of silence in snow and solitude. All of it ending because he had opened a door. They'll come back, he said. Crow will bring more men, better men. We can't stay here. Santa Fe, Sarah said. There's a judge there, Richard Blackwood. My father trusted him. If we can get the ledger to him, he can convene a grand jury. 64 men exposed. Trials. Maybe even justice. 300 miles, through winter, with every hired gun in the territory hunting us. Yes. Caleb stared at the fire, watching flames consume wood and turn it to ash. Everything he had built here would be ash soon too. The cabin, the trap lines, the careful isolation that had kept him sane. But Sarah was right. The man who had refused orders at Goliad was still inside him somewhere, still capable of choosing right over easy, still willing to pay the price for that choice. He stood and began packing. Ammunition, dried meat, furs for trade, his spare rifle, the Patterson Colts and all their precious ammunition. Everything that could fit on 2 horses and keep them alive for a journey that would probably kill them. Sarah watched him work. You're coming with me. I don't have a choice. You made sure of that when you led them here. Now I'm in it, whether I want to be or not. I'm sorry. Caleb paused in his packing. No, you're not. You did what you had to do. I understand that. But don't pretend you're sorry for choosing survival over honesty. She nodded, accepting the rebuke. We leave before dawn, Caleb said. While the storm covers our trail, we've got maybe a day's head start before Crow sends reinforcements. He moved to the corner where he kept his most personal possessions. A small Bible that had belonged to his mother. A daguerreotype of his parents, the image faded but still recognizable. He wrapped both carefully and added them to his pack. Sarah noticed. Those matter to you. They're all I have left of before the war, before Goliad, before I learned what men become when they stop questioning orders. As he packed, a thought struck him. He turned to Sarah. That wounded man, the one I shot in the hip, he's still alive out there. Sarah stood. We should help him. If we do, he'll tell Crow which direction we're heading. If we don't, he'll freeze to death. It was a test, Caleb realized. Not of his mercy, but of his character. The easy thing would be to let the man die. The right thing would cost them their advantage. He made his choice. They found the wounded attacker 30 yards from the cabin, his trail clear in the snow. He had made it to the tree line before collapsing. His leg was shattered bone visible through torn cloth. He would not walk again without a surgeon, and surgeons were rare as saints in the Colorado mountains. Caleb knelt beside him. The man looked up with eyes full of hate and pain. Gonna finish it, he gasped. No, Caleb said. He pulled the man closer to a large pine, creating a windbreak. He splinted the leg with branches and cloth torn from the man's own coat. He left water and jerky within reach. He took the man's weapons and boots. You live or die on your own luck now, Caleb said. But I won't murder a helpless man, even one who came to murder me. The wounded man's expression shifted from hate to confusion. Why, Pa? Because I'm not Silas Crow, Caleb said, and I won't become him to defeat him. He and Sarah turned to the cabin. As they gathered the last of their supplies, the wounded man's voice carried through the storm. Crow's waiting in Santa Fe. He's got the judge already. You're riding into a trap. Caleb and Sarah exchanged glances. The information changed nothing. They had to go to Santa Fe, had to try to reach Judge Blackwood. But now they knew the enemy would be waiting. As dawn approached, gray light seeping through the storm, Caleb took one last look at the cabin he had built. 7 years of his life contained in those walls. 7 years of running from who he had been. He closed the door and did not look back. The choice that defined Sarah mounted the horse Caleb had prepared for her, moving stiffly because of her wound. Caleb took his steel gray stallion, the animal snorting and stamping, eager to move after being confined during the storm. They rode south into the breaking dawn, into weather that could kill them, and toward men who definitely would try. Behind them, the cabin sat silent and empty. Ahead, 300 miles of winter and violence waited. Caleb had spent 7 years choosing safety over purpose, choosing isolation over engagement, choosing to hide from the world rather than face what he had seen and done. That choice had kept him alive, but it had not made him whole. Now, with a wounded woman riding beside him and a ledger full of truth in his saddlebag, he had chosen differently. Not because he wanted to, not because it was safe, but because the man he had been at Goliad, the man who had refused to murder prisoners, was still alive somewhere inside the hermit he had become. And that man, that younger version, who had believed in honor and justice, demanded to be heard. The storm began to clear as they descended from the high peaks. Sunlight broke through in shafts that turned the snow to blazing white, beautiful and deadly. Behind them, miles back but closing, Silas Crow gathered his hunters, men who killed for money and asked no questions about the rightness of their targets. Men who would track them across 300 miles of wilderness and never stop until the ledger burned and Sarah Whitmore's body lay cold in an unmarked grave. But ahead of them, somewhere in the distance, lay the possibility of justice. The chance that one honest judge could stand against 64 corrupt men. The hope that truth, when properly documented and bravely delivered, could still matter in a world that seemed designed to crush it. Caleb did not know if they would make it to Santa Fe, did not know if Judge Blackwood could be trusted, or if they were riding into the trap the wounded man had warned about. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had opened the door. He had let Sarah in. And that choice, made in a moment of storm and blood, had set him on a path he could not leave, not without becoming the coward Silas Crow had always claimed he was. Wyoming Territory, 1893. The present moment. Thomas Stone stared at his grandfather, seeing the old man with new eyes. You left everything, your cabin, your safety, all of it, for a stranger who had manipulated you. Caleb nodded slowly. Not for her, for meaning. I had spent 7 years being safe and alone. But safety without purpose is just waiting to die. That ledger, those names, those murdered families represented something I had been missing. A reason to be more than just a man who survived. But she lied to you, used you. She chose me, Caleb corrected. And there's a difference, though I didn't see it then. When you're heading into Sioux territory with your railroad survey maps, Thomas, you'll meet people who need help, people who might not tell you the whole truth about why they need it. The question isn't whether they're manipulating you. The question is whether they're worth the cost of helping. Thomas looked at the ruined ledger, at the names still visible despite 50 years of aging. Was she worth it? Caleb smiled, the expression soft and somehow complete. Boy, before I answer that, you need to hear about Wade Bennett, the best friend I ever had, and the man who almost betrayed me. He refilled their coffee cups as the Wyoming wind rattled the windows. Outside, Thomas's packet bags waited for morning. Inside, the story continued. The mountains did not forgive mistakes. Caleb had learned this truth through 7 winters of isolation, watching men who thought themselves prepared disappear into storms and never emerge. Now descending from his cabin's high sanctuary, with Sarah Whitmore riding beside him, he felt the weight of that knowledge pressing against his ribs like a stone. 3 days into their journey, the snow lay deep enough to swallow a horse's legs to the knee. Each step forward became a negotiation between the animal's strength and the mountain's resistance. Caleb led breaking trail on his stallion, the big gray's breath coming in plumes of white vapor. Sarah followed her mare, struggling, but game the woman herself, sitting straighter in the saddle than she had that first night, despite the wound in her shoulder. They moved through forests of spruce and aspen, the trees heavy with snow, that fell in sudden avalanches whenever the wind gusted. Caleb navigated by the sun when it appeared by the stars, when darkness came by the moss on tree trunks, and the way water carved the land when neither sun nor stars could guide. He was teaching Sarah without words, pointing to signs she needed to understand if she was going to survive this journey. Here he showed her the tracks of a mountain lion, the paw prints larger than a man's hand, spaced far apart in the running gait of a predator that had passed hours before. There he indicated the scrape marks on a pine where an elk had rubbed velvet from new antlers, the sign weeks old but still readable. He showed her how to read weather in the color of clouds, how purple meant snow and gray meant wind, how the silence of birds warned of storms better than any barometer. Sarah learned quickly. She had the mind of someone educated in books, but flexible enough to accept wisdom that came from experience rather than pages. By the second day, she was spotting animal sign before Caleb pointed it out. By the third, she could predict weather changes an hour before they arrived. But education in mountain craft could not erase the tracks they left behind. On the evening of the third day, Caleb found what he had been dreading. Two sets of boot prints crossing their trail no more than 12 hours old. Professional trackers moving fast, reading their path as easily as Caleb read the forest. He said nothing to Sarah, but that night he did not build a fire. They ate dried venison cold and slept in shifts, Caleb's rifle never leaving his hands. The fourth day brought them to Snake River Junction, where three canyons met in a natural crossroads that funneled all traffic through a narrow passage. Caleb had known they would have to pass this point, had known it was the perfect place for an ambush. But the alternatives meant adding a week to their journey, and time was a luxury they could not afford. He scouted ahead on foot, leaving Sarah with the horses moving through the rocks with the silence of smoke. The junction appeared empty. No tracks, no sign of recent passage. But something felt wrong. The birds were too quiet. The wind carried a scent that did not belong, the faint trace of tobacco and unwashed men. Caleb was considering turning back when he saw it. Carved into the trunk of an aspen, fresh enough that sap still wept from the cut's two letters. W. B. Wade Bennett. The name hit Caleb like a fist to the gut. He had not seen Wade in 7 years, not since they had parted ways after mustering out of the Texas forces. Wade had gone to rangering, chasing outlaws across the territory with a badge and a reputation for never giving up a trail. Caleb had gone to the mountains chasing nothing but silence. Below the initials, another message: if you're following, meet at Snake River Junction. The note was addressed to someone, but Caleb could not tell who. It could be a message for other rangers. Could be a trap. Could be Wade himself somehow knowing that Caleb would pass this way and leaving a sign only an old friend would recognize. Caleb returned to Sarah and explained what he had found. Her hand went instinctively to the ledger hidden in her saddlebag. Could he be working for Crow? Wade wouldn't work for a man like Crow, but he might work for the bounty on that ledger. $10,000 is enough to make most men reconsider their loyalties. They approached the junction carefully, rifles ready, eyes scanning every rock that could hide a shooter. The canyon walls rose 40 feet on either side, narrow enough that a good rifleman could control the entire passage. If Wade or anyone else wanted to stop them, this was where it would happen. The voice came from above, from the rocks on the southern rim, carrying the lazy drawl of East Texas. Caleb Stone, still the hardest man to kill in 3 territories. Caleb's rifle came up, tracking toward the sound. A figure stood from behind a boulder, hands visible, and empty, a Winchester held loosely in one hand, but pointed at the sky. Wade Bennett looked older than Caleb remembered. The 7 years had carved lines around his eyes and threaded gray through his dark hair. He wore a battered trail coat and canvas pants, the remains of a Texas Ranger star still pinned to his vest, though the silver had tarnished to black. His face, weathered and lean, split into a grin that did not quite reach his eyes. Wade, Caleb's voice carried no warmth, just acknowledgement. That's all 7 years and just Wade. Wade began climbing it down from the rocks, moving with the careful balance of a man who had spent years in rough country. I was hoping for something more dramatic, maybe tears of joy. A manly embrace. Why are you here? Wade reached the canyon floor and stood 20 feet away, close enough to talk without shouting, but far enough to react if Caleb decided to shoot him. I heard about the ledger. Heard about Crow hunting a nun with a book that could hang half the territory. Figured you might need someone who can shoot straight. Sarah urged her horse forward, positioning herself beside Caleb. Her rifle, the Kentucky long gun Caleb had given her, rested across her saddle with the casual readiness of someone who had learned its weight. How did you hear about the ledger? Wade reached into his coat, moving slowly, and pulled out a folded paper. He tossed it toward them. Caleb dismounted and picked it up, unfolding it to reveal a wanted poster. The likeness was crude but recognizable. Sarah's face stared back from the page, rendered in harsh lines and cross-hatching. Below it, text in bold print: $5,000 for Sister Margaret Whitmore in Ledger. $3,000 for Caleb Stone, dead or alive. Apply to Silas Crow or any association representative. These are posted in every settlement from here to Santa Fe, Wade said. Half of Colorado's hunting you. The other half is waiting to see who collects first. Caleb studied the poster, noting the details. The association. Not just Crow working alone, but an organized network with resources and reach. The bounty on him was new, added since the cabin attack. They had escalated from trying to quietly retrieve the ledger to publicly declaring war. So you came to help. Caleb's tone made it clear he did not believe altruism motivated this reunion. Wade's grin faded, his eyes gray as winter sky met Caleb's without flinching. I came to help, but I should tell you something first. I'm in that ledger of yours. Page 34. Paid Wade Bennett, former Texas Ranger, $300 for false testimony against homesteader Jack Morrison. Morrison hanged. Land transferred to Crow's employer. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush stone. Sarah's hand tightened on her rifle. Caleb's finger moved to his trigger guard, not quite touching the trigger, but close enough to matter. You helped kill an innocent man, Sarah said, her voice flat with the effort of controlling rage. I did, Wade agreed. Needed money. Told myself Morrison was probably guilty anyway. Found out later he had a wife, 3 kids. They died that winter after the land was taken. No support, no home. Froze to death in a makeshift camp outside Pueblo. And you expect us to trust you, Caleb asked. No, I expect you to use me. I'm in that ledger, which means if it reaches Santa Fe and a real judge sees it, I hang for murder. But I'm going to help you get it there anyway. Why, Wade's face, normally mobile and expressive, went still as carved wood. Because I see that little boy's face every night. Jack Morrison's son. 4 years old when they hanged his daddy. If I'm going to hang for what I did, at least let it be for truth instead of lies. Caleb studied his old friend, looking for the deception, the angle, the hidden motivation that would explain why a wanted man would help deliver the evidence of his own crime to the authorities. But Wade's eyes held nothing but exhausted honesty and something that might have been relief at finally speaking the truth aloud. You ride with us, Caleb said slowly, but I watch you every moment. And if you make a move toward that ledger, I put you down. Wade nodded. Fair enough. They made camp that night in a shallow cave Wade had found during his scouting, a place where rock overhang created shelter and the stone walls would hide any fire they built. Caleb allowed a small blaze, just enough to warm coffee and drive back the worst of the cold. They needed the heat more than they needed invisibility at this point. 3 days of frozen camps had left them all moving stiffly, the cold seeping into joints and making every motion painful. Sarah tended her shoulder wound, changing the dressing with practiced efficiency. The injury was healing clean, no infection despite the rough conditions. Wade watched her work with professional interest. You know medicine, he observed. My father taught me. He said a marshal's daughter should know how to treat gunshot wounds, snake bites, and broken bones. He was right. Your father was Joseph Whitmore, Wade said. Not a question. I met him once, 5 years ago in Denver. He was investigating land fraud cases even then. Good man, honest. The kind of marshal that made Rangers look bad by comparison. He was murdered for that honesty, Sarah said. I know, I heard about it. Heard it was supposed to look like a robbery, but a man like Joseph Whitmore doesn't get killed for his pocket watch. Wade poured coffee for all of them, the gesture automatic and domestic despite the circumstances. I'm sorry for your loss. Sarah accepted the coffee but said nothing. Her grief was not for sharing with a man who had admitted to corruption, even if that man claimed to seek redemption. Caleb sat with his back to the cave wall, positioned where he could see both the entrance and his companions. His rifle lay across his knees. He had not let it leave his hand since Wade appeared. How many hunters are tracking us? He asked. Last I counted, maybe 20 spread across the territory, but they're not coordinated. Bounty hunters working alone or in pairs, all racing to be first to collect. That's good for you. They'll get in each other's way, maybe even fight over who has rights to the kill. In Crow, Wade's expression darkened. Crow's not hunting, he's waiting. In Santa Fe, according to the rumors. He's got the judge you're trying to reach under house arrest. Turn the whole territorial capital into a trap with you as the bait. Sarah looked up sharply. Judge Blackwood is imprisoned. Not officially, but he can't leave his house without escorts. Can't convene court without approval from territorial authorities who are all in Crow's pocket. Your father's ledger lists half the government. They've closed ranks. The fire crackled. Outside the cave, wind moaned through the rocks. The news should have been devastating, a confirmation that their mission was already doomed. But Caleb found himself oddly calm. Traps could be sprung from the inside as easily as from the outside. And a man who expected his prey to walk into his ambush might not prepare for prey that attacked instead. "We keep going," he said. "Santa Fe is still the only place with courts that might matter. If Blackwood can't help, we find someone who can." "Oh," Wade nodded approvingly. "Knew you'd say that. You always were too stubborn to quit." Says the man who tracked us across 3 days of mountain trail in winter. I prefer to call it persistent. Wade settled back against the cave wall, his rifle within easy reach, but not held. The gesture of trust was noted and filed away. "Speaking of persistent, there's a group of 6 hunters about 2 days behind you. Professionals. They're not rushing, just tracking steady. Those are the dangerous ones. Can we lose them? Maybe, but there's more coming from the south. Crow's sending reinforcements up from Santa Fe. You're going to be caught between 2 forces within a week unless we do something to thin them out." The tactical situation crystallized in Caleb's mind. Hunters behind, hunters ahead. 300 miles of hostile territory with winter making every mile twice as hard. They could not outrun pursuit indefinitely. Eventually, numbers would tell. Sarah spoke quietly, staring into the fire. "My father spent 3 years building that ledger. 3 years of risking his life every day to document what these men have done. I've been running for 4 months, watching good people die to protect it. I'm not giving up now." "Nobody's talking about giving up," Caleb said. "Just acknowledging that we're in a fight we might not win." "Then we make sure it costs them," Sarah replied. "Even if we don't make it to Santa Fe, someone will find that ledger eventually. Someone will read those names and know the truth." Wade smiled, a genuine expression this time. "Your father raised a fighter." "He raised a lawyer," Sarah corrected, "but circumstances have required adaptation." They finished their coffee in silence, each person alone with thoughts of the journey ahead. Caleb found himself studying Wade, looking for signs of the man he had known in Texas. The ranger who had stood with him during the revolution. The friend who had pulled him out of a Mexican prison camp. The soldier who had refused to leave wounded behind even when retreat was the only sane option. That man was still there, visible in the set of Wade's shoulders and the way his eyes constantly scanned for threats. But something else lived there too. Guilt, shame, the corroding knowledge that he had betrayed everything he once stood for because he needed money and told himself one lie would not matter. Caleb understood that corrosion, carried his own version of it from Goliad. The difference was that Wade had a chance to make his betrayal mean something, to transform murder into sacrifice by ensuring the ledger that documented his crime also destroyed the men who had paid him to commit it. It was not redemption. Nothing could bring back Jack Morrison or his family. But it was something, a last act that might let Wade die with a portion of his honor intact. The sound of distant gunfire jerked them all alert. 3 shots spaced evenly coming from the north. A signal, not a fight. Wade moved to the cave mouth, listening. "That's the hunters behind us. They've found someone." "How do you know?" Sarah asked. "Because that's how you signal when you've made contact with prey but need backup. 3 shots. Wait, 3 more shots if the prey runs. 2 if you've made the kill." They waited in tense silence. No second volley came. "They've got someone pinned," Wade said. "Could be travelers, could be homesteaders, could be another group of hunters who got mistaken for you in the dark." "Not our problem," Caleb said, though he felt the lie as he spoke it. Everything that happened in these mountains was their problem now. Every innocent person caught in the crossfire was on them because they carried the ledger that had turned this territory into a war zone. But they could not save everyone, could barely save themselves. Morning brought clear skies and temperatures cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. They broke camp before dawn, riding south and west, angling away from the direct route to Santa Fe. Wade suggested they use the Arkansas River as their path, following its course through canyons that would hide their passage and provide water for the horses. The plan was sound, but it meant crossing the river at some point. And in November, the Arkansas ran fast and cold with snowmelt, its current capable of sweeping a horse off its feet and drowning rider and animal both. They reached the crossing point Wade had scouted on the 8th day of their journey. The river here ran between high banks, the water perhaps 40 feet across but moving with the speed of a freight train. Ice formed along the edges where the current slowed, but the center ran black and deadly. "We'll need a rope," Wade said, studying the crossing. "Tie the horses together, lead them across. If one goes down, the others can pull it up." Caleb had rope. He always carried 100 feet of good hemp for situations exactly like this. But as he prepared to rig the crossing, Sarah dismounted and stood at the river's edge, staring at the rushing water. "I can't swim," she said quietly. Wade looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Sarah. This particular piece of information would have been useful to know before they planned a river crossing. "Why didn't you mention this earlier?" Wade asked, his tone more curious than angry. "Because I thought we'd find a bridge, or a ford, or that the river would be frozen solid." Sarah's voice carried the brittle edge of someone holding fear back through force of will. "I grew up in Boston. The only water I saw was in bathtubs." Caleb dismounted and stood beside her. The river roared past, indifferent to their needs, following laws older than human civilization. Fear of water was not cowardice. It was sensible respect for an element that killed the unprepared. "I can teach you enough to survive the crossing," he said. "Not real swimming, just how to keep your head up and kick towards shore if you go in." They spent an hour on the basics. How to inflate your lungs and hold air to increase buoyancy. How to kick with your legs rather than thrashing with your arms. How to angle across current instead of fighting it directly. Sarah learned with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, but Caleb could see the terror underneath her concentration. When they finally rigged the crossing with all three horses roped together and Caleb leading on his stallion, Sarah sat rigid in her saddle. Her face had gone white, her hands gripped the saddle horn with enough force to make her knuckles bloodless. "If you go in," Caleb told her, "don't fight the rope, let it pull you. The horses will get you across." She nodded but said nothing. Words had abandoned her. The crossing went wrong exactly halfway across. Caleb's stallion hit a submerged rock and stumbled, the sudden movement jerking the rope tight. Sarah's mare, already nervous from the current, reared and lost its footing. The horse went sideways into the water, and Sarah went with it. Caleb saw her go under, saw the current grab her and drag her downstream. The rope held, but Sarah was not tied to it, just holding the saddle of a swimming horse. She surfaced once, gasping her eyes wide with panic. "Let go of the saddle," Caleb shouted. "Kick for shore." But panic had her now. She clung to the thrashing horse, getting dragged deeper as the animal fought the current. Caleb made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He drove his stallion the rest of the way across, hit the bank running, and dove back into the river upstream of Sarah. The cold hit like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. The current grabbed him and tried to slam him into rocks. He fought it with everything he had, swimming at an angle, letting the water carry him towards Sarah while he controlled direction. He reached her just as she lost her grip on the saddle, grabbed her coat, pulled her head above water, kicked for the bank with her weight dragging him down. Wade was there, rope in hand, throwing it toward them. Caleb caught it on the second throw. Wade hauled them both to shore, the rope cutting into Caleb's hands, but pulling them free of the current that wanted them dead. They lay on the rocks, coughing up river water, shaking from cold and shock in the aftermath of near drowning. Wade built a fire despite the risk because hypothermia would kill them faster than any bounty hunter. As they dried their clothes and absorbed heat from the flames, Sarah started laughing. Not hysteria, but genuine mirth at the absurdity of their situation. "I came 300 miles to deliver evidence to a judge," she said between gasps of laughter. "Survived gunfights and mountain storms. And I almost drowned in a river because I can't swim." Caleb found himself smiling despite the cold still locked in his bones. "Could be worse, could have drowned and lost the ledger." "The ledger's wrapped in oilcloth. It would have survived fine." She looked at him, the laughter fading into something softer. "You didn't have to come after me. You could have let the rope pull me across." "Could have," Caleb agreed. "Didn't seem right. Because I'm carrying evidence you need for your journey." "Because you matter," Caleb said simply. "Ledger or no ledger, you matter." Wade, tending the fire, glanced up at them and smiled but said nothing. Some moments did not need commentary. That night, warm and dry in a camp Wade found among a stand of pine, they talked, really talked for the first time since joining forces. The kind of conversation that happens when people have survived death together and the barriers between them have eroded. Wade told them about Jack Morrison, about the trial that was a sham, about the testimony Wade had given knowing it was false, telling himself the $300 would let him start over somewhere, about how he had spent that money on whiskey and whores trying to forget, and how the money ran out but the memory never did. His widow came to me a year later, Wade said, staring into the fire. Found me in a ditch in Pueblo, drunk and mean. She could have spit on me, could have shot me. Instead, she asked me if I was going to lie there forever, or if I was going to make it right. I told her I couldn't make it right. He was dead because of me. She said, then make it mean something. That's when I started tracking the ledger rumors, started looking for a way to ensure that if I hang for what I did, at least it won't be for nothing. Sarah listened without judgment, her face illuminated by firelight. The ledger can't bring your friend back. Can't undo what you did. I know. But it can stop the next Jack Morrison from being murdered. Maybe that's enough. Caleb spoke quietly, his voice rough with old pain. At Goliad, 342 men were executed, prisoners who had surrendered believing they'd be paroled. Instead, they were marched out and shot. I refused the order. 12 others refused with me. We were beaten, degraded, called cowards and traitors. But we didn't fire. The rest did. They followed orders and murdered unarmed men. He poured whiskey into his cup but did not drink. It just held it like the weight in his hands helped ground him. For 7 years, I told myself I was better than them, that I had chosen honor. But I wasn't better. I was just too weak to follow orders. And those 342 men died anyway. My refusal changed nothing except making me feel righteous about my cowardice. Sarah moved closer, her hand resting on his arm. You weren't a coward. You were a man with a conscience. Conscience doesn't stop bullets, Caleb said. Doesn't bring back the dead. Just makes you feel noble while the killing happens anyway. No, Wade said firmly. It makes you different. The men who followed orders at Goliad went home and told themselves they had no choice. They slept fine, raised families, never thought about the faces of the men they killed. But you carry those faces, and that carrying is what makes you worth following now. Because you understand the parents. The three of them sat in silence, each carrying their dead. Joseph Whitmore for Sarah. Jack Morrison for Wade. 342 executed prisoners for Caleb. The weight of those ghosts created a bond stronger than blood, a shared understanding that some debts could never be repaid, but had to be acknowledged nonetheless. On the 10th night, Caleb woke to find Wade gone. The ledger which Sarah kept in her saddlebag was gone too. He did not wake Sarah immediately. Instead, he studied the camp reading sign. Wade had left an hour ago, judging by the cooling embers he had disturbed. His tracks led east, back the way they had come. One set of boot prints, one set of horse tracks, and the faint impression of saddlebags heavier than they should be. Caleb woke Sarah with a hand over her mouth, the universal signal for silence and danger. Her eyes opened alert instantly. He pointed to the missing ledger, to Wade's absent bedroll. Sarah's face went white, then red with fury. He's selling us out. Maybe, or maybe he's thinking about it. Caleb began saddling his horse, moving with efficient speed. Either way, we're getting that ledger back. They tracked Wade for 2 miles through darkness, following his trail by moonlight and the disturbed snow that marked his passage. The tracks led to an abandoned mining shack, a structure of rotting wood and rusted metal that had probably stood empty for a decade. Light showed through the gaps in the walls, firelight warm and flickering. Caleb approached on foot, rifle ready. Sarah followed her, Kentucky long gun loaded, and her face set in an expression that promised violence if Wade had betrayed them. Through a crack in the wall, Caleb could see Wade sitting at a makeshift table constructed from barrel staves. The ledger lay open before him. An empty whiskey bottle lay on its side. Wade's head rested in his hands. Caleb kicked the door open, rifle raised. Wade looked up, his face wet with tears, his hands empty of weapons. Do it, Wade said quietly. I know what you're thinking, know what I look like. Just do it and get it over with. Why did you take the ledger? Sarah demanded, her rifle aimed at Wade's chest. Because I needed to read it again. Needed to see my name there in black ink next to what I did. Needed to decide if dying for this book is worth it or if I should just destroy it and save myself. Caleb lowered his rifle slightly. And what did you decide? Wade gestured to the ledger still intact on the table. I got halfway to burning it, had the kindling ready, had matches in my hand. Then I read the other names, all 63 of them. Read about families murdered, land stolen, children orphaned, and I realized something. What? Sarah asked, her rifle still trained on him. That if I burn this book, I'm not just saving myself. I'm killing everyone those 63 men will hurt in the future. Every homesteader they'll drive off their land. Every witness they'll silence. Every child they'll orphan. I can't bring back Jack Morrison, but I can stop the men who paid me to kill him from doing it again. He stood slowly, hands visible and empty. I wrote out here because I needed to make the choice alone. Needed to know if I was doing this because it's right or because you two were watching. And I figured it out. I'm in that book, page 34. And if that ledger reaches Santa Fe, I hang. But 63 guilty men hang with me, and that math works. Caleb studied his friend, seeing the truth in Wade's eyes and the acceptance of his fate. This was not the bargaining of a man trying to save his skin. This was the resolution of someone who had made peace with death. What changed? Caleb asked. I stopped trying to run from what I did and started trying to face it. Took me 7 years, but I finally learned the lesson you tried to teach me at Goliad. Sometimes refusing to run is braver than fighting. Wade picked up the ledger and carried it to Sarah, offering it with both hands like a sacred text. I'm sorry for taking it, for scaring you, for everything I've done that brought us here. But I'm not running anymore. Not from the law. Not from what's right, not from anything. Sarah took the ledger, her rifle finally lowering. What you did to Jack Morrison can't be undone. I know. You're going to hang if this ledger reaches Judge Blackwood. I know that too. Then why be shine? Wade's smile was sad but genuine. Because dying with honor beats living with shame. And because maybe the last thing I do can be something good, even if everything before it was corrupt. They returned to camp as false dawn began to gray the eastern sky. None of them slept. They sat around the rebuilt fire drinking coffee and preparing for what came next. Because what came next announced itself with the thunder of hooves and the glint of rifle barrels in morning light. 12 riders appeared on the ridge to the north, silhouettes against the rising sun. They did not charge immediately, just sat their horses in a line, a show of force meant to intimidate. Caleb counted them through his rifle sight. 12 men, professional bounty hunters by their spacing and discipline. This was not a random group of opportunists. This was an organized hunting party, probably the reinforcements Crow had sent from Santa Fe. Wade checked his ammunition. I've got maybe 20 rounds. Caleb had 30. Sarah had 15. 65 bullets total against 12 men who probably carried twice that many. Math's not good, Wade observed. Never is, Caleb replied. The hunters did not attack immediately. They held position on the ridge just out of effective rifle range, making their presence known, letting fear do its work. Sarah gripped the ledger tight against her chest. They're waiting for something. Waiting for us to run, Wade said. Drive us into the arms of the hunters coming from the south. Classic pincer movement. We're caught between two forces. Caleb studied the terrain, open ground to the south, steep cliffs to the west, the river they had crossed to the east. The only route was north, directly toward the waiting hunters. We go through them, he said. Wade looked at him like he had lost his mind. 12 against 3. They expect us to run. We charge, break their line, keep moving before they can reform. It was insane, suicidal. The kind of plan that got men killed, but Sarah was nodding, seeing the logic. The hunters had numbers and position, but they also had confidence, and confidence made men slow to react when prey acted like predators. We do it together, she said. All 3 of us. No one gets left behind. They mounted their horses, checking weapons one last time. Caleb took point. Sarah and Wade flanked him. 3 riders against 12. 3 people who had chosen to fight rather than hide. The hunters saw them coming and hesitated clearly, not expecting a charge. That hesitation cost them. Caleb's rifle roared first, the shot taking the lead hunter from his saddle. Wade fired a heartbeat later, wounding another. Sarah's shot went wide, but the attempt scattered the hunters' formation. Then they were in among them, horses colliding, rifles firing at point-blank range. Chaos and gunsmoke and screaming horses. Caleb fired his Patterson Colts, the revolvers giving him firepower the hunters did not expect. Wade wielded his rifle like a club when it ran empty, smashing a hunter from his saddle. Sarah stayed low, using her horse's neck as cover firing when she had clear shots, conserving ammunition with the discipline Caleb had taught her. They broke through the line, leaving dead and wounded behind, but two hunters detached from the main group and gave chase. Caleb turned in his saddle, aimed, fired. The first pursuer went down. The second kept coming. Wade reined his horse around directly into the path of the charging hunter. The two men collided, horses tangling, both going down in a crash of horseflesh and cursing men. Wade hit the ground hard, his rifle flying from his hands. The hunter recovered faster, drawing a knife, diving toward Wade's exposed back. Caleb's shot took the hunter in the throat. The man gurgled and fell. Wade climbed to his feet, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, but otherwise intact. His horse had broken a leg in the fall and had to be shot, the sound of the mercy killing echoing across the morning. Now they were two horses carrying three riders, and the remaining hunters were reforming for another assault. "Go," Wade shouted. "I'll hold them." "No," Caleb said. "Caleb, listen to me." Wade's voice carried the calm of a man who had made his peace. "You need to reach Santa Fe. Need to get that ledger to Blackwood. I can buy you time. We go together or not at all." "Damn your stubborn pride." Wade grabbed Caleb's arm, his grip fierce. "I told you I stopped running. This is me standing still. This is me making Jack Morrison's death mean something. Let me have this." Sarah's voice cut through their argument. More riders, South Ridge. 6 more hunters appeared, cutting off their escape route. 18 total now, with them caught in the middle. Wade's eyes met Caleb's. In that gaze, past 7 years of friendship, a revolution survived together. A bond forged in blood and maintained through distance. Caleb saw the request there, the plea for permission to die on his own terms. "How long can you hold them?" Caleb asked, his voice breaking. "Long enough." Wade checked his remaining ammunition. "I've got 12 bullets and a good position in those rocks. That's 12 more of Crow's men who won't see Santa Fe." Sarah handed Wade her spare ammunition. "Make it count." Wade accepted it with a nod of respect. Then he looked at Caleb one last time. "Tell them I died better than I lived. I'll tell them you died a man Jack Morrison would have forgiven." Wade smiled. "That's all I wanted." He turned and ran for the rocks, his rifle already firing, drawing the hunters' attention away from Caleb and Sarah. They spurred their horses west toward the cliffs, toward a narrow trail Wade had scouted that might, if they were lucky and blessed, lead them around the ambush. Behind them, the sound of gunfire echoed through the canyons. Wade's rifle, distinctive and regular firing, with the precision of a man who knew each shot might be his last, returned fire from the hunters, sporadic at first, then concentrated as they realized Wade was alone. Caleb did not look back. Could not. If he looked back, he would turn around, and Wade's sacrifice would be wasted. They rode hard, the single horse carrying both of them, struggling under the weight. By midday, they had put 5 miles between themselves and the ambush. The sound of gunfire had stopped an hour ago, replaced by a silence that told its own story. Wade Bennett, Texas Ranger, corrupt lawman, and finally redeemed friend, had made his stand. Had held off 18 hunters long enough for 2 people and a ledger to escape. Had died the way he had chosen to live in his final days, with honor. Wyoming Territory, 1893. The present. Thomas Stone stared at his grandfather, seeing tears in the old man's eyes for the first time in his life. "Wade died so you could escape." Caleb nodded slowly. "Wade died so the ledger could reach Santa Fe, so that his name written on page 34 as a murderer would also be written in history as the man who chose truth over survival. He bought us 3 days with his life, 3 days that made all the difference." "Did you make it to Santa Fe?" "We made it, but what waited there was worse than anything we had faced in the mountains, Usmayans. Because in Santa Fe, Silas Crow had prepared a trap so perfect that walking into it seemed like the only option. And sometimes, boy, the only way to spring a trap is from the inside out." The old man stood stretching stiff joints and walked to the window. Outside, dawn was breaking over Wyoming. Soon Thomas would leave for his own journey into disputed territory, carrying his surveyor's tools and his grandfather's story. "Before I tell you about Santa Fe," Caleb said, You need to understand what Wade taught me that day. He taught me that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about facing it and choosing to let your last act define you instead of your worst one. When you get to Sioux country and you see the railroad's hired guns driving homesteaders off their land, you'll have to choose your job or your conscience. Wade showed me that the right choice is usually the one that costs you everything. Thomas joined his grandfather at the window. And if I make that choice, then you'll sleep better at night even if you sleep cold and hungry. And that boy is worth more than any amount of railroad money. The sun rose red over the Wyoming plains, painting the frost-covered grass in shades of blood and gold. In a few hours, Thomas would ride toward his own reckoning. But first he needed to hear how his grandfather's story ended, how the ledger reached Santa Fe, how Judge Blackwood made his choice, and how Silas Crow finally faced justice for his crimes. The ending was still to come, but the lessons had already been learned. Santa Fe rose from the desert like a prayer written in adobe and timber, its church spires reaching toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Caleb and Sarah sat their exhausted horse on a ridge overlooking the territorial capital, studying the town that held both their salvation and probable death. 12 days since leaving the cabin, 5 days since Wade's sacrifice, 300 miles of winter and violence condensed into 2 people and a ledger that had cost more lives than Caleb cared to count. Sarah looked different now. The nun's habit was long gone, replaced by buckskins and a wool coat traded from a sympathetic homesteader. Her hair, previously hidden beneath the habit's cowl, hung in a dark braid down her back. The shoulder wound had healed to a pink scar. Her hands, once soft from a life of books and legal documents, now showed calluses from rifle work and hard writing. But her eyes had changed most. They held a hardness that came from watching good men die and learning that survival required choices no person should have to make. Crow's men are everywhere, Caleb said, counting the figures moving through Santa Fe's streets. At least 20 hired guns that he could identify by their bearing and the way they watch corners and rooftops. They've turned the whole town into a garrison. Then we don't ride in together, Sarah said. I go alone. You create a distraction. That's suicide. That's strategy. She turned in the saddle to face him, her expression fierce with determination. They're looking for a mountain man and a nun traveling together. They're not looking for a woman alone seeking legal counsel or a drifter drinking in a saloon. We use their expectations against them. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to insist they stay together, that splitting up meant losing the only ally either of them had left. But she was right. Together, they were recognizable. Separate, they might slip through Crow's net long enough to reach Judge Blackwood. How do you know Blackwood's even alive? He asked. We only have the word of hunters who want us dead. Because my father trusted him, and my father was never wrong about men. She pulled the ledger from her saddlebag, unwrapped it from its oilcloth protection. The leather cover was stained and worn, but the pages remained intact, 3 years of investigation preserved through blood and sacrifice. This reaches Blackwood, or it doesn't, but I won't die wondering if I could have done more. They made their plan as the sun climbed toward noon. Sarah would enter Santa Fe from the east, posing as a woman seeking legal advice about a land dispute. She would carry the ledger hidden in a hollowed Bible, the kind of religious text that even hired killers might hesitate to search too thoroughly. Her destination was Judge Blackwood's house, a large adobe structure on the plaza that served as both residence and courthouse. Caleb would enter from the west, creating noise and distraction in the saloons and gambling halls that lined that side of town. A drunken mountain man looking for whiskey and trouble would draw attention away from a quiet woman seeking a judge's counsel. It was a thin plan full of holes, and dependent on luck, they had no reason to expect. But thin plans were all they had left. Before they separated, Sarah reached into her coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. She handed it to Caleb. What is this? He asked. The rosary my father gave me when I told him I wanted to become a nun. He said even if I didn't take vows, I should keep it, to remember that some things are worth believing in even when belief seems foolish. Caleb unwrapped the cloth, revealing a simple rosary of wooden beads and a small silver cross. Nothing expensive or ornate, just honest craftsmanship and faith. Why are you giving this to me? Because if I don't make it out of the Blackwoods house, I want you to finish this. Get the ledger to someone who can use it. Don't let my father's work die because I failed. You're not going to fail. Sarah smiled, but her eyes remained sad. We don't know that, but I know that you're the kind of man who keeps promises, even ones that cost him everything. So promise me. If I fall, you finish it. Caleb closed his fingers around the rosary, feeling the smooth beads and the weight of the commitment she was asking him to carry. I promise. They clasped hands, once a grip that said everything words could not convey. Then Sarah turned her horse east and rode towards Santa Fe without looking back. Caleb watched her go, memorizing the set of her shoulders and the way she sat her horse like someone who had earned the right to be exactly where she was. Then he turned west and began his own approach to the trap waiting below. Santa Fe's western edge was a collection of adobe buildings that served the rougher elements passing through the territory. Saloons with names like the Lucky Dollar and the Broken Spur offered whiskey gambling and the kind of company that did not ask questions about a man's past. Caleb chose the Silver Snake, a two-story structure with horses tied outside and the sound of voices carrying through open windows. He dismounted, tied his horse loose enough for a quick escape, and pushed through the doors with the rolling gait of a man who had already been drinking. The saloon fell quiet as he entered 24 pairs of eyes assessing the stranger. Caleb let them look, playing the role of a mountain man fresh from trap lines and looking to spend his earnings on civilization's vices. He ordered whiskey at the bar, paying with coins that had been hoarded for exactly this purpose. The bartender, a thick man with scarred knuckles and knowing eyes, poured without comment. Caleb drank, letting the alcohol burn its way down, then ordered another. You look like you've been living rough, the bartender observed. 3 months on a trap line, Beaver and Martin. Good season. Caleb's voice came out rougher than usual, his accent shifting toward the frontier drawl he had left behind years ago. Figured I'd spend some of the take before heading back up. Long way to come just for whiskey. Whiskey tastes better when you haven't had any for 3 months. The bartender nodded, accepting the logic, and moved away to serve other customers. Caleb nursed his second drink, watching the room's reflection in the mirror behind the bar. Most of the patrons had returned to their conversations and card games. But three men in the corner continued to watch him with the focused attention of predators evaluating prey. Crow's men. Had to be. Their clothes were too clean for honest work, their hands too soft for labor. They wore revolvers positioned for quick draws rather than practical carrying. Professional guns waiting for a target that matched the description on the wanted posters plastered across half the territory. Caleb had to give them a reason to focus on him, had to make enough noise to draw attention away from Sarah's approach to the judge's house. But he also had to survive long enough to know if she succeeded. He ordered a third whiskey and carried it to a poker table where four men were playing for small stakes. Room for another. The men looked at him, then at his coins, and nodded. Money was money, and a drunk mountain man looked like easy pickings. Caleb played poorly at first, losing hands he should have won, building the image of a man with more money than sense. The pile of coins in front of him shrank steadily. The other players relaxed, smelling blood in the water. Then Caleb won a hand, then another. His play tightened, his bets became strategic, and the money began flowing back toward him. One of the other players, a rancher by his clothes and sunburned face, began to grumble about luck changing too fast. Maybe your luck's just running out, Caleb suggested mildly. Maybe you're cheating, the rancher shot back. Maybe you're just bad at cards. The rancher stood, his hand moving toward his belt, not toward a gun, but toward a knife that hung in a leather sheath. I don't take insults from drifters. Caleb stood, two hands visible and empty. And I don't take accusations from men who can't tell skill from luck. The three hired guns in the corner perked up, sensing violence. One of them said something to his companions, gesturing toward Caleb. Recognition beginning to form. The rancher drew his knife, a working blade meant for cutting rope and skinning game, not fighting. But angry men used what they had. He lunged across the table, scattering cards and coins. Caleb sidestepped, caught the man's wrist, twisted until the knife fell. Then he drove his elbow into the rancher's face, breaking his nose with a wet crunch. The rancher went down, hard, blood streaming. The saloon erupted. Men shouted. Chairs overturned. The bartender came around the bar with a club, trying to restore order. And the three hired guns drew the revolvers, pointing them at Caleb with the steady hands of professionals who killed for wages. Caleb Stone, one of them said, you're worth $3,000. More if we bring you in alive for Crow to question. Caleb's hands rose slowly, apparently in surrender. but his weight shifted to the balls of his feet, his eyes tracking the positions of all three gunmen and calculating angles. I don't know what you're talking about. You match the description. Mountain man, scar on your left hand, eyes like winter ice, that's you. Lots of men have scars. Not many ride with a woman carrying a ledger worth $10,000. The gunman smiled confident in his numbers. Where is she, Stone? Where's the nun? Caleb's mind raced. They knew about Sarah, knew she was in Santa Fe, or about to be, which meant Crow's network was better than they had hoped, his intelligence more complete. I don't know any nuns, Caleb said, and I don't know you, so I'm going to walk out of here, and you're going to let me, because starting a gunfight in a crowded saloon gets people killed who don't deserve it. The only person dying here is you if you don't answer questions. Caleb looked at the bartender, at the rancher bleeding on the floor, at the dozen innocent men who had come here for whiskey and cards, not violence. Crow's hired guns did not care about collateral damage, would shoot through bystanders to reach their target. He made his choice. His hand blurred toward his coat, coming out with one of the Patterson Colts. He fired 3 times before the hired guns could react. The shots were not aimed to kill, but to wound and disable. One man took a bullet in the shoulder, spinning him around. Another caught lead in his chin, his revolver clattering to the floor. The third dove for cover, returning fire wildly. Caleb was already moving, using the bar for cover, firing again as he backed toward the door. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Men screamed and scrambled for safety. He hit the street, running, vaulting onto his horse, and spurring the animal into a gallop. Behind him, the saloon emptied as hired guns poured into the street, shouting for help, organizing pursuit. Caleb rode hard through Santa Fe's western neighborhoods, drawing the chase away from the plaza where Sarah was making her approach to Judge Blackwood. More men joined the pursuit, some on foot, others mounting horses. Gunfire cracked bullets, hissing past his head. He led them through narrow streets and around adobe corners, using his knowledge of urban terrain to stay ahead. But Santa Fe was not that large, and eventually he would run out of places to hide. A bell began to ring, the town's alarm, summoning more of Crow's men. Caleb heard whistles and shouts coordinating the search. They were organized, disciplined, and determined. He had bought Sarah time, but whether it was enough remained to be seen. He ditched his horse in an alley, knowing the animal was too distinctive and would draw attention. On foot, he could hide in the adobe maze of the old town, could disappear into shadows and doorways. He pulled his coat tight and his hat low, becoming just another man in a town full of them. The pursuit thundered past his hiding place, hunters following the wrong trail. Caleb waited until silence returned, then began working his way back toward the plaza and Judge Blackwood's house. If Sarah had succeeded, she would be inside now, presenting the ledger to the one man her father had trusted. If she had failed, she would be dead or captured, and Caleb's promise to finish her mission would come due sooner than expected. Either way, he had to know. Judge Richard Blackwood's house stood on the north side of the plaza, a 2-story adobe structure with barred windows and a heavy wooden door. 4 armed men stood guard outside their positions, suggesting they were there to keep people in as much as keep people out. Caleb watched from across the plaza, hidden in the shadow of a merchant's awning. The guards were alert but not aggressive, their attention focused on the street rather than the plaza itself, looking for threats coming from outside rather than already inside, which meant Sarah had made it past them, had somehow convinced them to let her enter. The nun's habit might be gone, but her ability to project innocent purpose remained. Caleb settled in to wait, watching the house for any sign of what was happening within. Minutes crawled past like hours. The guards shifted position, relaxed slightly, as the initial alarm from the saloon disturbance faded. Someone brought them coffee. They drank and talked casual conversations about nothing important. Then the door opened and a man emerged. Silas Crow had aged 7 years since Goliad, but Caleb would have recognized him in complete darkness. The pale eyes that had smiled while executing prisoners. The thin frame that somehow conveyed more menace than larger men could achieve. The precise movements of someone who wasted no motion and calculated every action. He wore black from his hat to his boots, the only color the silver of his belt buckle and the ivory grips of his matched revolvers. He moved like a predator, all coiled potential and dangerous grace. 6 men followed him out of the judge's house, armed, all carrying the confidence of soldiers who had won before the battle began. They spread out across the plaza, taking positions that covered every approach. Crow himself stood in the doorway speaking to someone inside. His voice carried across the plaza, calm and conversational, despite the violence implicit in his presence. Judge Blackwood, I appreciate your hospitality, but I think we both know this conversation is finished. The woman inside your house is wanted for multiple murders and theft of government property. I'm taking her into custody. A voice from inside, older and rougher, responded with equal calm. You have no authority here, Crow. I'm still a federal judge and this is my courtroom. If you want to arrest someone, you'll need proper documentation. The only documentation I need is this. Crow pulled a paper from his coat, unfolded it with a theatrical flourish. Executive order from the territorial governor. In matters of territorial security, federal protections are suspended. Sarah Whitmore is a threat to territorial security. Therefore, I'm authorized to use whatever force necessary to apprehend her. Silence from inside the house. Then a different voice, female and defiant. Sarah. That order is illegal. The territorial governor doesn't have authority to override federal jurisdiction. He does when the federal judge in question is himself under investigation for corruption. Crow's smile was audible in his voice. Judge Blackwood, you want to tell Miss Whitmore about page 51 of her father's ledger. More silence. Then Judge Blackwood spoke, his voice heavy with something that might have been shame or might have been resolution. Page 51 lists a campaign contribution I accepted in 1841, $2,000 from a land company. I didn't know at the time that the company was controlled by the same men I was supposed to be investigating. But ignorance isn't innocence. The ledger is correct. I took money from corrupt sources. So you see, Miss Whitmore, Crow continued, the judge you came to save can't even save himself. Now come out peacefully, hand over the ledger, and maybe I'll make your death quick. No, the single word spoken with absolute finality echoed across the plaza. Caleb felt pride surge through him. Sarah had learned many things on their journey, but the most important was that some fights could not be avoided, only faced. Then I'll come in and take you, Crow said. His hand moved in a signal, and his men advanced toward the door. The gunshot that followed was not from Crow's men. It came from inside the house, a single crack of a small caliber weapon. One of Crow's men jerked backward, a red stain spreading across his shoulder. Judge Blackwood's voice, stronger now, rang out. I'm still a federal judge and this is still my courtroom. You want to arrest someone, Mr. Crow, you go through proper channels. Until then, you and your men can vacate my property. You just shot one of my men. I defended my home against unlawful entry, perfectly legal under territorial law. Crow's patience, never abundant, snapped. Burn it. Burn the whole damn house down. His men hesitated. Burning a federal judge's house was the kind of action that brought consequences even corrupt territorial governors could not ignore. But Crow pulled one of his revolvers and pointed it at the nearest man. I said burn it. The man moved, pulling a flask of oil from his saddlebag. Others followed. They began splashing oil against the adobe walls, soaking the wooden door and window frames. Caleb could not wait any longer. Sarah was inside. Judge Blackwood was inside. And the ledger, the evidence that had cost so many lives, was about to go up in flames. He stepped out of the shadows. His rifle raised, his voice, carrying the parade ground authority of a man who had once commanded soldiers. Step away from that house, Crow. Every gun in the plaza swiveled toward him. Crow turned slowly, his pale eyes finding Caleb across the distance, recognition and satisfaction mixing in his expression. Caleb Stone, I was wondering when you'd show yourself. Crow holstered his revolver, a gesture of confidence that he did not need weapons to handle this confrontation. 7 years since Goliad. 7 years you've been hiding in the mountains, telling yourself you were the moral one, the hero who refused orders. I wasn't a hero, just a man who wouldn't murder prisoners. And look where it got you, standing in a plaza with a dozen guns pointed at your head, about to die for a woman you barely know, and a cause that's already lost. Caleb kept his rifle steady, aimed at Crow's chest. The cause isn't lost until the ledger burns, and I'm not letting that happen. You can't stop it. You're one man. I have an army. Then your army's about to learn what one man with nothing left to lose can accomplish. Crow smiled, the expression cold and empty as a winter sky. This isn't Goliad Stone. There's no moral high ground here. Just you and me and the choice we both made. I chose power. You chose conscience. Let's see which one keeps us alive. Before either man could act, the door to Judge Blackwood's house opened. The judge himself emerged, a frail man in his 70s, dressed in formal robes despite the circumstances. He carried a derringer in one hand and the ledger in the other. Sarah stood behind him, her rifle ready, her face determined. Judge Blackwood walked slowly to the center of his porch, placing himself between Crow's men and the house. His voice, trained by decades of courtroom oratory, carried across the plaza with surprising strength. I am Judge Richard Blackwood, appointed by federal authority and sworn to uphold the law. The woman behind me is Sarah Whitmore, daughter of Federal Marshal Joseph Whitmore, who was murdered while investigating corruption in this territory. The book I hold contains 3 years of documented evidence compiled by Marshal Whitmore before his death. He paused, letting the words settle. Citizens had begun to gather at the edges of the plaza, drawn by the commotion. Shopkeepers, housewives, laborers, the ordinary people whose lives happened in the spaces between violence. This ledger lists 64 men, the judge continued, who have used their positions to steal land, murder homesteaders, and corrupt the legal system that should protect the innocent. I am one of those 64 men. My name appears on page 51. I accepted money from sources I should have investigated. For that crime, I deserve to face justice. He opened the ledger, holding it up so the gathered crowd could see the pages filled with careful handwriting. But my crime and the crimes of every man listed here pale beside the crime of Silas Crow. He has murdered families, burned churches, killed federal marshals, and intimidated judges, all in service of an organization that treats this territory like their personal property. Crow's hand moved toward his revolver. Enough speeches, old man. You're under arrest for corruption and harboring a fugitive. By whose authority? Judge Blackwood demanded. The territorial governor's the same governor listed on page 43 of this ledger as having accepted $50,000 in bribes, or perhaps by your own authority, Mr. Crow. The authority of a man who smiled while executing prisoners at Goliad and has been killing for money ever since. The crowd murmured. Crow's men looked uncertain. This was supposed to be simple. Capture a woman, destroy evidence, maintain power. But instead it was turning into a public spectacle. Crow drew his revolver, pointing it at the judge. Last chance. Hand over the ledger and the woman or I kill you where you stand. Judge Blackwood met his gaze without fear. Then kill me, but know that this ledger has been copied, that the names in it are already being circulated to newspapers in Denver, St. Louis, and Washington. You can kill me, but the truth is already spreading beyond your reach. It was a bluff. Caleb knew it was a bluff. There had been no time to make copies or send them anywhere. But Crow's hesitation suggested he was not certain. You're lying, Crow said. Am I? The judge's smile was grim. Are you willing to bet your empire on it? The standoff might have continued, might have ended with negotiation instead of blood, if Judge Blackwood had not done one final unexpected thing. He turned to the crowd, holding the ledger high, and began to read names aloud. Territorial Governor William Hayes, $50,000 in bribes. Sheriff Marcus Webb, 20 payments of $500 each for ignored crimes. Judge Samuel Carter, $8,000 for fixing land dispute verdicts. Rancher Thomas Blackwell, $15,000 for stolen homesteads. Crow's revolver bucked the shot, echoing across the plaza. Judge Blackwood staggered but did not fall. He had been hit in the shoulder, not the heart. He continued reading. Dr. James Morton paid to falsify death certificates. Banker Charles Reed paid to deny loans to target homesteaders. Crow fired again. This time the judge went down, the ledger falling from his hands. But Sarah was there, catching it before it hit the ground, continuing where the judge had left off. Land agent Robert Sullivan coordinated 12 murders for property seizure. Crow turned his revolver towards Sarah. Caleb fired first, his rifle shot taking Crow in the shoulder, spinning him around. The pale-eyed killer's gun fell from his hand. Then chaos erupted. Crow's men opened fire. Caleb dove for cover behind a wagon. Sarah retreated into the house. The crowd scattered, screaming. Caleb worked his rifle like a machine, firing and reloading with the speed of desperate necessity. He dropped 2 of Crow's men before they could advance, wounded a third. But there were too many, and they had him pinned. A voice from the crowd changed everything. I'm on page 12. Caleb looked toward the sound. A man in a sheriff's star stood there, his badge held in his hand. Sheriff Marcus Webb, his name read aloud by the dying judge. I took bribes. Webb continued, his voice carrying across the plaza. 20 times. $500 each. I looked the other way while good people were murdered. I'm guilty of everything that ledger says. He dropped his badge in the dust and drew his revolver. But instead of pointing it at Caleb or Sarah, he aimed it at Crow's men. But I'll be damned if I let you burn that evidence to save yourselves. Another voice joined his, a merchant from the crowd's edge. Page 23, William Tucker. I witnessed the Morrison murder and stayed silent because Crow paid me $200. Then another and another. Men stepping forward, confessing crimes, admitting guilt, but refusing to let the ledger be destroyed to protect the worst among them. Page 67, Daniel Frost. I helped steal land from Widow Miller. Page 39, Thomas Garrett. I testified falsely against homesteaders. The cascade of confessions rolled across the plaza like thunder. More than 20 men ultimately stepped forward, each one condemning himself by speaking aloud what the ledger had already documented. Crow's hired guns, surrounded now by armed men who had chosen truth over self-preservation, lowered their weapons. Some dropped them entirely. Others backed away, hands raised in surrender. Crow himself, bleeding from his shoulder wound, his pale eyes burning with rage and disbelief, pulled a second revolver and lurched toward the judge's house, towards Sarah. Caleb stepped into his path. It's over, Crow. It's never over. Crow raised his revolver, his hand shaking but his eyes steady. Men like me don't lose to cowards like you. Then I guess we'll find out if conscience beats corruption. They fired simultaneously. Both shots found their targets. Caleb felt the impact in his side, a burning numbness that spread like fire. But his own shot hit true, punching through Crow's chest directly over his heart. Crow looked down at the spreading red stain, then back up at Caleb. His pale eyes held surprise, as if death was not something he had ever truly believed would claim him. You were supposed to be weak, he whispered. Too moral to do what's necessary. Being moral doesn't mean being weak, Caleb said. It just means knowing what you're fighting for. Crow felt his revolver clattering on the plaza's stones. He tried to speak again, but blood filled his mouth. His eyes, those pale winter eyes that had smiled at Goliad while executing prisoners, went empty and still. Silas Crow, enforcer and killer architect of suffering for countless families, died in the dust of a Santa Fe plaza, with the evidence of his crimes spreading across the territory. Caleb sank to his knees, his hand pressed against the wound in his side. Sarah emerged from the house, the ledger clutched against her chest, and ran to him. How bad? She asked, pulling his hand away to examine the injury. Bad enough. Caleb's voice came out weaker than he intended. But I've had worse. You're lying. Maybe, but the ledger's safe. That's what matters. Judge Blackwood, still alive despite his wounds, was being tended by citizens who had heard his confession and chosen to help him anyway. The men who had confessed their own crimes stood in a loose circle, guarded by others who had not been named in the ledger, waiting to face whatever justice would come. The territorial governor, arriving too late to influence events, stared at the scene with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed empire crumble. The newspapers that would soon receive copies of the ledger would destroy him. The federal investigators who would inevitably come would finish what Marshal Joseph Whitmore had started. Sarah helped Caleb to his feet, supporting his weight as they moved toward Judge Blackwood. The old judge, pale and shaking but alert, looked up at them with something like pride. Marshal Whitmore would be proud of you, he told Sarah. You finished what he started. We all did, Sarah corrected. You, Caleb, Wade Bennett, my father. Everyone who chose truth when lies were easier. The judge nodded, then turned to the crowd. As a federal judge, even a corrupt one, I have the authority to convene a grand jury. I'm calling one now, today, and I'm presenting this ledger as evidence of crimes that demand investigation. He looked at the men who had confessed. You've admitted your guilt. That will be considered when sentencing comes. But you'll face trial alongside the men who paid you, because justice doesn't pick favorites. Over the next 3 weeks, while Caleb recovered from his wound and Sarah worked with lawyers who arrived from Denver and Washington, the trials began. 64 indictments, 34 convictions, 12 men hanged for murder, 18 imprisoned for fraud and corruption, 8 who took their own lives rather than face the courts. Judge Richard Blackwood was among those convicted. He faced his sentencing with the same dignity he had shown when reading names aloud despite being shot. He received 5 years in prison, reduced to 3 for his cooperation and his final act of courage. The territorial governor fled to Mexico. He was never seen again. The ledger itself was published in full by newspapers across the country, becoming a symbol of how deep corruption could run when good men stayed silent and how powerful truth could be when good men finally spoke. Sarah Whitmore became the territory's first female lawyer, taking over her father's practice and continuing his work of protecting homesteaders from land theft. She never returned to the convent. The choice between faith and justice had been made for her when she learned to shoot and kill in defense of truth. Caleb returned to the mountains, but not to hide this time. He took a position as a guide and scout for legitimate land surveyors, helping homesteaders find good claims and protecting them from the hired guns who still tried to drive them off. The isolation he had sought for 7 years no longer appealed. He had learned that meaning mattered more than safety. They parted as friends bound by shared trauma and mutual respect, but not by romance. Some bonds ran deeper than love, rooted in the kind of sacrifice that changed who people were at their core. On the day Caleb left Santa Fe, Sarah gave him back the rosary. "Keep it," he said. "Your father gave it to you. And I'm giving it to you, to remember that some storms are worth riding into." He took it, feeling the smooth beads and the weight of everything they represented. "Will I see you again?" Sarah asked. "In a territory this small, probably." "Good, because I'm going to need honest witnesses when I take on the next corrupt land company." Caleb smiled. "I'll be there." And he was. 3 times over the next decade when Sarah's legal battles required someone who could testify to what he had seen and survived. Each time he left the mountains and came to whatever town needed his presence, speaking truth in courtrooms the way he had once spoken it with rifles. But those stories belonged to different days. On this day, he simply rode north toward the high country, carrying a rosary and a memory of the woman who had changed his life by knocking on his door during a blizzard. Wyoming Territory, 1893. The present day. Thomas Stone sat in silence, absorbing the weight of everything his grandfather had shared. Outside, full dawn had arrived, painting the frost-covered plains in shades of gold and crimson. "So the ledger made a difference," Thomas finally said. 34 convictions. The corruption exposed. "It made a difference," Caleb agreed, "but not the difference I expected. I thought truth would fix everything. Thought once people knew what was happening, they'd rise up and demand justice. And some did. But others just found new ways to be corrupt. New schemes, new bribes. The ledger stopped one generation of criminals, but it didn't stop crime itself. Then was it worth it, Wade's death, your wound? Everything you sacrificed?" Caleb stood and walked to where Thomas's packed bags waited. He picked up the surveyor's compass, feeling its weight, its precision. "When you get to Sioux territory, you're going to see the railroad using hired guns to drive homesteaders off land that was legally theirs. You're going to be asked to survey routes that require removing families from their homes. And you're going to have to choose whether to keep your job or keep your conscience." He set the compass down and picked up the old ledger page he had kept framed on his wall. Jack Morrison's entry. Wade Bennett's crime preserved in ink and shame. Wade couldn't bring Jack Morrison back. The ledger couldn't undo the murders already committed. But it stopped the next murder, saved the next family, and that Thomas is worth everything it cost. Thomas touched the rosary beads his grandfather had placed on the table beside his bags. "What do I do if I choose conscience and lose everything?" "Then you'll be broke and cold and probably angry, but you'll sleep at night without hearing the ghosts of people you could have helped but didn't. And boy, when you get to be my age, sleep matters more than money ever will." The young man stood, shouldering his pack, picking up his rifle and compass. At the door, he paused. "Did you ever see Sarah again? After those times you testified for her?" Caleb smiled, a private expression that held memories he did not share. Once more, 10 years after Santa Fe, she had become territorial attorney by then, still fighting the same fights, just with a bigger title. We had coffee, talked about old times, then we went our separate ways. "Do you regret not staying with her?" "No, what we had was better than romance. It was respect, and that lasts longer than any marriage I've seen." Thomas opened the door, inner wind rushing in to fill the warm house with cold promise. Thank you, Grandpa, for the story, for the lessons. Remember them when you're standing in front of homesteaders being evicted. Remember that the right choice is usually the one that costs you everything. And if you make that choice, come back and tell me about it. I want to know that the old lessons still matter. Thomas nodded and stepped into the dawn. Caleb watched him ride away, a young man heading toward his own reckoning, carrying the weight of his grandfather's past in the hope of making different choices than the men in the ledger had made. When Thomas had disappeared into the distance, Caleb returned to his chair and picked up the rosary. The beads were worn smooth from 50 years of being carried and handled. The silver cross, once bright, had tarnished to a dark patina, but it still worked, still served its purpose of reminding him that some things were worth believing in, even when belief seemed foolish. He closed his eyes and thought about that night, 50 years ago, when Sarah Whitmore had knocked on his door during a blizzard. Thought about Wade Bennett making his final stand in a canyon. Thought about Judge Blackwood reading names aloud while being shot. Thought about all the people who had chosen truth over safety and paid for that choice with their lives. The cost had been terrible, the victories incomplete, the corruption never fully eradicated, but the ledger had mattered. The stand had mattered. The choice to open a door instead of hiding behind it had mattered. And in the end, mattering was enough. Caleb Stone, 80 years old, former soldier and mountain man, keeper of promises and carrier of ghosts, sat in his Wyoming home and felt at peace. Not because the fight was over, but because he had fought it when fighting mattered most. The sun rose higher, burning away the frost, warming the land. Somewhere to the south, Thomas rode toward his own storm. And somewhere in Caleb's memory, a younger version of himself stood in a cabin doorway and made the choice that defined everything that followed. He had opened the door, let the stranger in, and that single act of compassion, manipulated though it had been, had given his life meaning it had lacked for 7 years. Some storms you run from, some storms you ride into, and some storms carried in the hearts of wounded strangers you invite inside and let change you forever. That was the lesson. That was the truth. And 50 years later, it still held.